You a little bit about my experience with TA65, my personal reasons for being here, but I'm absolutely certain that all of you will have some similar reasons for wanting to experience longer and healthier lifespans for yourself and the people that you love. I will cover some of the questions that I commonly am asked. So let me just get to the very basics. If there's anything you take away from this, TA65 is a naturally occurring molecule. It's derived from the astragalus plant. The current dosage recommendations are anywhere between 1 and 4 capsules a day. I've been taking 4 capsules a day now for 3.5 years. The dosage recommendations vary with who you talk to. I have my own set of criteria for that. Basically, the older you are and the sicker you are, the more you need, or the more aggressive you want to be about your anti-aging program, the more you need. I'd like to be very aggressive, so I take a higher dose. However, it's been shown in pharmacokinetic studies that any dose that you take will turn on telomerase. And every one of us has individual pharmacokinetics, so unless you have a pharmacokinetic study done, you're probably not going to know exactly what the best dosage is for you. So I go by feel. TA65 tends to be very energizing. I like that, so I take a lot of it. And then, of course, it has lengthened my telomeres, so I'm very, very interested in that. One of the reasons I'm here is this guy standing behind me. That's my father. This picture was taken in 1990. I'm 32 there. My dad is 69. And my dad was an amazing guy. He was an individual who was a spiritually enlightened person. He was kind. He was gentle. He was good-hearted. And he brought out the best in people. As a matter of fact, I saw hardened criminals confess their sins and their crimes to my father in the office. And he was known, of course, as Dr. John, hence Dr. Dave. Dr. John, they often called him by accident Father John. And some people even said he was a saint. So one of the reasons why I'd like to stick around a lot longer is because I can tell you that age 54, number one, I'm not enlightened. And number two, I am far from a saint. So I would certainly like to have the opportunity to catch up with my dad. The other story I want to tell you about is how my father passed away. He was 79 years old. He was playing tennis at 79, drove home, got out of the car, slipped on the ice, and hurt his back. And the next day he went to work, even when his back was sore, he went to work because that's what these iron men of medicine did in those days. And some of you probably had those in your family as well. I always knew my dad would go out with his boots on. I always knew it. He went to work and he fell again, and this time he was in intractable pain and was hospitalized. And that happened about 10 years after this photo was taken. Now, there's something about this photo I want to show you. It's going to be hard for you to see, but if you look at my dad, and he'll forgive me for pointing this out, his head is rather large for his body. How many anti-aging doctors are in this room? Can I see a show of hands? Okay. What do we call it when you lose muscle mass? Sarcopenia, and power loss is dynopenia. My dad is beginning to show sarcopenia there. The other thing you can't really see very well, but he's beginning to get hunched over, and he's lost about 1.5 inches of height over his 5'10" that he was when I was young. He's about 5'8" there, so what do we call that when you start losing height and bone mass? Osteoporosis. And what does that constitute in a man? What's the name for that? We call it menopause in women. What do we call it in men? What happens? Low testosterone. He has andropause. Now, in 1990, we didn't have the term andropause. And testosterone was something that only bodybuilders used. So when I was studying anti-aging medicine at the time, the A4M didn't even exist until 1996. So there was no real guidance as far as what to do for my father. But I knew that he needed testosterone, and I actually suggested growth hormone to him, and his response was typical of an old school physician. He said, nah, that's for bodybuilders and dwarfs. I'm really not interested. And unfortunately, retrospectively, that would have been something very, very beneficial for my father. I asked him 2 or 3 times over the next 10 years, and he declined. 10 years later, when he fell on the ice, he was admitted to the hospital in intractable pain. They tried narcotics. That didn't work. That just made him sick and vomited. They tried steroids. That didn't work. That just drove his blood sugar, which was already high from his type 2 diabetes, through the roof. They stuck a catheter in his back to put medication directly into his spinal fluid, and they forgot to take it out, and it got infected, and he died of Staph aureus septicemia. So who killed my dad? Who was responsible for it? Was it the doctors, the iatrogenic complications of a catheter, or maybe even the malpractice? My dad didn't die of staph aureus. He did die of staph aureus septicemia, but the reason he was there, the reason he had even probably his diabetes was because he had andropause. He had low testosterone. If you look at the correlation of diabetes with testosterone levels in men, you will see there's a direct correlation. If you look at osteoporosis in men, you will see there's a direct correlation. Who could have saved him? Me. But I didn't do a very good job of it, did I? And my dad, I really do miss him. But when he passed away, I decided that I wasn't going to let this happen again. I was going to be part of the solution, not the problem. I wasn't going to be a Cartesian medical doctor and just stick my fingers in the dike and every time something sprung a leak, try to fix it till I ran out of fingers. I was actually going to attack the problem of aging, and ultimately things did come my way. The A4M came along, the AMMG came along, and much, much later, telomerase activation came along. So I want to thank personally Cal Harley for his role in discovering telomerase activator number 65 and all the things that that's doing for people out there. Cal, thank you so much for that. I want to thank Bill Andrews for introducing me to the concept and teaching me about telomeres and telomerase. Bill, what can I say? Thank you for all on behalf of my family, on behalf of myself. I want to thank Greta Blackburn, who's not here tonight, for allowing me to participate in the Immortality Edge. I want to thank Mike Fossil for his guidance and keeping an eye on me, making sure I don't say anything stupid, or at least not vilifying me when I commonly do. And I want to thank Noel Patton for having the cojones to actually put his desires on the line and come out and allow this thing to come out and be something that we can all take. My father had short telomeres disease. And every one of the illnesses of aging that my dad had could have been at least mitigated by effective anti-aging therapy, including telomerase activation. So I promised him I was going to do something about it, and that's why I'm here tonight. That's why this path has led me to this. I should also mention that it was Bill that got me on TA65, but it had nothing to do with aging, so if there's time at the end, I'll tell everybody why that happened and how that happened. All right, just a couple of scientific points here I want to touch upon. Everybody talked a lot about inflammation and free radical damage. You all know about free radical damage. You know that free radicals are high energy particles that do damage to proteins. They do damage to fats. They do damage to genetic material. They can cause mutations. They can cause changes in cellular membranes and intracellular membranes. They can cause mitochondria to leak. And by the way, the mitochondria have a double-walled membrane, double lipid bilayer, probably deliberately to keep all that high energy stuff in there. And when it begins to leak, you start to see some of the changes of cellular senescence, and they are intimately involved in that process, as well as apoptosis, as you will see. So you all know about diet and exercise, and Louisa did a wonderful job of explaining how these things cause both inflammatory genotypes and inflammatory phenotypes. So I want to just reiterate very quickly. Lack of sleep is inflammatory. Stress is inflammatory. Lack of exercise, sedentary behavior is inflammatory. Lousy diets, especially those low in omega-3 fatty acids, are inflammatory. The average intake of omega-3 fatty acid in this country is 300 milligrams. It should be closer to 6 grams. That's where we're at with this. And the NIH is actually studying this for behavioral reasons in prisoners to see if they can repeat the studies done in England where prisoners behaved better. You see all this stuff come out. Meta-analysis showed no benefit to fish oil. I promise you that's all a bunch of nonsense. If you studied Professor Bill Land's data, which has been out for quite some time, you will see there's unmitigated benefits to omega-3s, and a lot of it has to do with their effects on telomeres. However, I want to tell you that most of what we have out there, everything that we have out there anyway, when it comes with regards to human studies now, in people, live people like us, nothing lengthens telomeres so far except for TA65. Fish oil, carnosine, green tea, all these things that have been studied have been either studied in petri dishes or have been studied in very short-term populations using qPCR over a period of 6 weeks, which is an impossible phenomenon. We may or may not get to talk about that. But here's what happens, okay? So if this is average telomere loss with each replication of the cell, maybe if you do some positive things in your life that Louisa talked about, you can slow that down to this. If you do some negative things in your life, you can speed it up to that. Okay, so a lot of that is up to you. But if you want to stop it or move it in this direction, especially with these critically short telomeres, you must be on a telomerase activator. Please understand that. Telomerase activation and all the things that you're reading about out there that may, when they say comparatively lengthen the telomeres in subjects, they're not really lengthening their telomeres. They're lengthening their telomeres relative to people who are doing bad things. And it's probably not due to telomerase activation. It's probably due to the antioxidant benefits. So please keep that in mind. And free radical damage causes all kinds of the diseases that are directly involved with telomere shortening. Telomeres have a compound called guanine, which is especially sensitive to oxidation. And so everything that causes inflammation and oxidation in the body can affect your telomeres negatively. Inflammaging and immunosenescence. I'm going to gloss over this, and my apologies to the erudite scientists in the room. Because I'm going to be mixing metaphors and making this a lot simpler than it really is. Claudio Franceschi, I always call him Franceschi. I want to make him Polish. Sorry. He coined this term inflammaging, and what he found was that as the immune system ages, it loses its ability to respond to new stimuli. So it doesn't have the capacity to fight off infections that it hasn't seen before nearly as well as it does when you are young and when you are healthy. And the natural tendency of those of us who are involved in the field initially, at least myself, was, oh, this must be stem cell burnout. Turns out that's not the case. What's happening is there's clonal expansion of T cells for very specific infections. Cytomegalovirus is the biggest bad actor of all of them. But what happens is the immune system gets immuno-obsessed. It gets busy trying to fight off these infections that never go away. These viral infections, these foodborne infections, the gingivitis that's chronic. Louise, you mentioned this kind of stuff. These chronic subclinical infections cause this ongoing expansion in the immune space and seem to lower its ability. Now, whether or not there's stem cell burnout, I would still guess there must be. But the bottom line is it loads up the immune system so it doesn't have the capacity to respond. And when the immune system cannot respond, it becomes senescent. Now, the other thing that happens is those cells that are around tend to be less functional. They tend to be less good at presenting antigens. They tend to be less good at killing things. And guess what? They have short telomeres. Now, the reason I bring this up is because TA65 was initially introduced as an immune modulator and definitely, without any question, reverses some degree of immunosenescence by reversing the ratios of active cells to inactive cells, by creating or allowing clonal expansion of naive cells. So if nothing else, if you took nothing else from this, this has been studied now by Cal and his team probably for 10 years. And again, there's nothing else out there that's been studied to that degree. And we know that immunosenescence is critical because if you don't die of a heart attack, the free radical damage, you're going to die of the immunosurveillance problem, either cancer or infection. And finally, sense-static activation. I want to mention this. It's not often mentioned, but Mike West Mike West is a former Geron, well, I guess he was the founder of Geron, actually, and now is at Biotime. In 1996, he did some very interesting studies with dermal cells that showed that even senescent cells are not quiescent. They're releasing an inflammatory bunch of inflammatory compounds. They have leaky mitochondria. Their mitochondrial membranes do not have the same potential, and I mean electric potential, to keep things sequestered in the mitochondria. They leak out into the cytoplasm. They leak out into the cells around them. They cause an immune response. Instead of sitting there in a rocking chair and removing themselves from the cell cycle, they are removed from the cell cycle. However, they are still inflammatory. And then, of course, apoptosis, the explosion of cells from inside out, is also highly inflammatory. As you age and you get more senescent cells and more apoptosis, this burden of sense-static activation goes up. And if you want to use the term allostatic, it's been used for other reasons, but this is the sort of allostasis of inflammation in your body. It's all related to short telomeres because cells don't become senescent if their telomeres don't get short in the main. Cells don't apoptose if they don't get shorter in the main. Cells that are immunosenescent, as we talked about with TA65, that can be reversed by using TA65. And of course, free radical damage, it turns out when Dr. Harley presents some of the data that I would guess that TA65 is also a pretty potent antioxidant because it seems to change all the inflammatory markers in a positive direction. Okay, this is a question I get asked a lot. Does TA65 cause cancer? Well, no, it doesn't, but here's the thing. There's always going to be somebody out there who seems to bring up the question, and I don't know how many million years it's going to take till it goes away. So I'm simply going to explain it to you, and I'll just say so far nobody's gotten anything that we could equate close to cancer from TA65. However, 85% of human cancers do express telomerase. They express it massively. They do it by gene amplification. They do it by any means possible, to quote Bill Andrews. And that's not the way telomerase activation works normally. Telomerase activation, in the normal sense, it finds the shortest telomeres and grows them. It doesn't generally add length to those telomeres that are already within normal parameters. In cancer, telomerase expression lengthens all, at least in the ones that have been studied so far. So there's a very huge difference between cancer telomerase activation and TA65 telomerase activation. There are SNP families in the H-TERT region. There are a bunch of SNP families that exist now that we know from the Human Genome Project. They're global. They're not just located to one chromosome. You know, you have to have this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one, and this one. If you have the whole family, then you have a slight increase in cancer, 5 to 10% at most. And one of those SNP families contains a SNP lesion in H-TERT. So some people have said, well, that means that H-TERT is potentially oncogenic. Evolutionary protection, a lot of people say, well, you know, God in the universe put telomerase inhibition there in our somatic cells so that we didn't get cancer. And it's an evolutionary protection. That's the fastest evolution I've ever seen, because as a race, we haven't really died of cancer for more than about 100 years in the main. Cancer is a relatively rare disease, a cause of death. So you have to have evolutionary pressure to have an evolutionary change. Then some of the really brilliant ones come out and say, well, it must be epigenetic. Epigenetics can change things very, very rapidly, but not in this particular type of thing. And I'll give you an example. If you want to change the actual metabolic behavior of an organism, you can look at something like high-altitude sickness. And what you see is that the Peruvian high-altitude community has been there for about 10,000 years. They get high-altitude sickness at almost the same rate you and I would. The Tibetan community has been there for 50,000 years. They don't get altitude sickness nearly as much. So the point is those big epigenetic shifts, and those are epigenetic, they're not genetic, they take tens of thousands of years. So that's not a good reason for it either. I have my own reasons. We probably won't get into why that is, and we probably don't need to. But oncogenic viral vectors, a lot of the early studies, genetic manipulations where telomerase was added to transgenic mice or mice that didn't have any telomerase at all or were half positive, half negative for H-TERT, used oncogenic viral vectors. Recently, Maria Blasco did a study using non-oncogenic viral vectors, and there was absolutely no incidence of cancer increase. The tale of two Geron products. I just wanted to mention the telomerase inhibitor imetelstat. I hope Cal mentions that, or he'll have the choice to do that or not. But it was interesting because so far it hasn't been very, very successful. And yet, when you look at telomerase activation, there's a possibility that telomerase activation may, it won't cure cancer the way we'd hope telomerase inhibitors would, but it may help prevent it by keeping your telomeres long, because cancer is a disease of short telomeres. And then finally, telomere length in cancer. One of the interesting things that does happen when you give telomerase activation in at least one study in one type of cancer, and you give telomerase inhibitors, the cancer sort of does an end around and goes to the ALT mechanism and lengthens telomeres that way and comes back more aggressive and worse than ever. So this is something that I'm sure more brilliant people like myself, than myself, will come up with an answer to. I still have hope for telomerase inhibition and cancer. I get asked about all the other stuff, and I want to just reiterate, TA65 is the only telomerase activator that has a telomerase activation related study in human beings. Okay, there was another product that came out with a comparison to a diet. It was part of a whole mixture of things. But so far, we only have TA65 with human studies. We have some other interesting compounds. Resveratrol I already talked about a little bit. I'm just going to mention that when I first came here in 2009 and gave this speech, it was called Resveratrol versus TA65, because resveratrol was the big anti-aging compound. And a lot of people were telling me, well, I don't want to take TA65 because TA65 is an activator and resveratrol is an inhibitor, and the two are they're not going to mix. So I predicted that evening. I said, first of all, resveratrol probably has nothing to do with telomeres. I could have been slightly wrong about that. Resveratrol probably has nothing to do with sirtuins. I was definitely right about that. Sirtuins probably are not directly related to longevity, and therefore I felt very sorry for the calorie restriction people. I was right about that, it seems. And GlaxoSmithKline bought Sirtus Pharmaceuticals for $750 million and was unable to reproduce the data that they were given from Sirtus, and nor were they able to make the super resveratrol compound go past round 2, phase 2 of clinical trials before it was noted to cause hepatotoxicity. So I was pretty good at predicting that. I also mentioned how great fish oil was. Been in that field for a long, long time. So fish oil probably works as an antioxidant. There's a fellow named Undurti Das who does a lot of research on omega-3s who has come out and said that he believes that fish oil is a telomerase activator. I sent my fish oil to Bill to test. Laura Briggs tested it. Said, sorry, pal, no telomerase activator. But it did increase cellular viability, which is something she said she had never seen from a supplement before at the time. So I was very happy with that. I think it's a phenomenal supplement. Louisa intimated about ratios. There's a finger stick test called Ideal Omega. I think everybody should do it. If you know your vitamin D level, you should know your omega-3 level. And of course, you should know your telomere length. Carnosine in very, very high doses, much higher than you could tolerate as a human being, will turn on telomerase. This is the problem with a lot of these things. You can control the situation in a lab. You can add as much or as little as you want, and then you can draw your conclusions from that. And it may not be physically possible. Vitamin D, I'm not convinced it's a telomerase activator. I think it probably does help preserve telomere length. Bacopa has been mentioned, and then astragaloside 4, which I am guessing is TAT1. So that probably has some activity as well. Recent developments I found very interesting. Maria Blasco released a paper, Mammalian Aging Linked to Short Telomeres, percentage increase in short telomeres. And a couple things came out. Number one was the merit of measuring the short telomeres, and Lifelength's test does also mean telomere length as well. There are other methods, as you know, that have a much bigger database, but looking towards the future, I'm very excited about this one. This piece of study that they're involved with is going to expand their database considerably. So I think some of the criticisms of what's going on there and the impractical nature of it are going to evaporate relatively soon. ENCODE was a study that was released. I think, did you mention, you mentioned epigenetics. So not only epigenetics, but the genome. The genome is made up, we have all these genes, but we have a lot more stuff that doesn't code for anything. Turns out those are binding sites for proteins, it seems, off-on proteins, and then of course the scaffolding, the protein, and the hexamer arrangement of DNA in its double helix, the way it actually looks in real life, with all the proteins attached to it. Looks more like if you took a beehive and threw honey on it and you have all these bees around it. That's kind of where epigenetics, which I think is really the interface between environment and the genome. And what really comes out of ENCODE and the epigenetics and genetics, of course, is that our genome is a lot more flexible, or I should say, not our genome, but our makeup, our informational systems are a lot more flexible and a lot more mutable than we believe them to be. And I'm very excited because it took a long time to decipher the human genome. The epigenome is much more complex, and yet I'm sure it's going to take far less time to decode that and make sense of it. Omega-3s, again, not so new. They've actually been around. You saw the Farzene study with the heart disease patients. Undurti Das has been writing about this for years. You know, what can I say? It probably should be part of anybody's anti-aging program. Like so many of the anti-aging guys in this room, like Cal and Bill, I'm an ultra runner. This is me finishing the Canadian death race. There I am speaking to the winner, Sean Meisner, who's 28, and that's our book, The Definitive Guide to Longevity for people who don't really understand telomeres.